My goodness.
There we go. Lisa Sharon Harper,
Yes.
welcome to the show. We finally made it work. Thank you for your flexibility with the
Yay.
scheduling. And also, I apologize for my inability to be flexible. I referenced a minute ago that I work at a bank. We're in the middle of a merger. There's just a lot going on.
Yes,
So
I get it.
apologies.
Hmm.
Yeah. But welcome. I'm glad you're here this morning.
Thank you so much. I'm actually really looking forward to this conversation.
Good. Well, hopefully nobody's told you anything about me. It's better that way. Nothing to live up to. So, well, good. So I always like to begin just with an understanding that maybe not everyone that is listening knows who you are. So just
Okay.
briefly, who and what are you?
Who and what am I? I am a human being. And I'm a human being whose alarm just went off. I'm sorry. Telling me to be on this podcast. So no, so my name is Lisa Sharon Harper. I am the president and founder of Freedom Road. Freedom Road is a consulting group that specializes in shrinking the narrative gap between us. And we do that as our primary strategy for how to move justice forward in the world in ways that don't have to do two steps back and then to do one step forward every 20 years, every generation. So we believe that part of the reason why we keep coming up to moments like 2016 when America elected Donald Trump. I don't know how your listeners feel about him, but for me as an African American woman, the election of Donald Trump literally gave shivers. I mean, I froze on election night when it was announced, and I felt like I felt like the permission to thrive had been drained from my body.
Hmm.
Literally, that's how I felt that night. But we don't have to come to that moment every 20 years, every generation. We can reconcile our narratives. And therefore, because we are all on the same page about who we are and how we got here, have a common vision for what it will look like to actually move America forward to becoming a greater and greater nation.
Yeah.
I'm a speaker, a writer, a consultant, an activist. In the time of Ferguson and Charlottesville, I was there on the front lines, pushing the powers that be, whether they be the police or the alt-right, to abide by and honor the inherent dignity of all people.
Yeah. Yeah. Definitely. I remember you
dog.
being here.
I'm a dog owner too.
Yeah. For those listening, I'm leaving the dog in. I'm not editing it out.
Oh, that's great. Okay.
And why not? And Dasher, if you would like to contribute, feel free. Dasher's our smallest one. So
her name is Babe.
Babe.
And she was a rescue dog. And we've just finished her training like a week ago. So she's doing pretty well right now.
Babe is now in the show notes. Also a guest. There we go. Yeah, I remember you. So I actually live right outside of Charlottesville. I work in Charlottesville.
Oh, wow.
Which made reading a lot of the parts of your book that you're here to discuss a bit. Like, I didn't grow up in Charlottesville. I grew up in Western Texas. But yeah, I remember you being where were you at? St. Paul's? Yeah.
Yeah, St. Paul's.
We were actually supposed to go over there and play with the kids. There's an outside water park down in the older sections of Charlottesville that's free to get into.
Wow.
On a hot day. And we did not go. Instead, we stayed at home because I was like, I'm not going over there. Yeah.
I remember the moment when we were told, if you go out in the street, the police have said they can't protect you and they won't protect you. So we don't know, you have to know you're taking your life into your own hands. You could die.
Yeah.
And I remember sitting there, literally sitting on the front pew at the church and asking God, what should I do? Because I knew my mom was going to be going into surgery. She was going to need my help. I was supposed to be the one helping her. And what if I die? Like, that literally was what went through my head. And what I heard God say was I heard this like still small voice in my head that said, be present, be present, and walk forward. So I joined the 80 other faith leaders who locked arms and walked up to Emancipation Park. And that day is history now.
Yeah. Yeah. I've eaten lunch at that park. That's where I started my banking career, was downtown Charlottesville, right next to the courthouse,
That's deep.
A block away. Yeah. Yeah, like I've never been, what's the word? Ashamed isn't the word. I don't know
Mm-hmm.
what the word is. I don't really have a word, but
Mm-hmm.
it's sad. And still being here in Charlottesville, it's still spoken about daily and is
Mm-hmm.
equally still argued about daily. And I'll
Mm.
just stare at people and be like, why are you even arguing about this?
Really?
What is
Wow.
wrong with you?
Uh,
Anyway,
yeah.
not why you're here. Well,
Okay.
although you wrote about it briefly in the book,
Yeah.
but
Mhm.
yeah. So you wrote a book that Lisa was very hard for me to read, because my history knowledge of many of the things that you write about in this book is non-existent.
Wow.
Being that I was educated in Texas, like a lot of the laws that you write about in
Yep.
Maryland and in Virginia, and then they're like, oh, but we wrote the law wrong. Um, this isn't helpful. Let's rewrite it because as a parent, I do that. We had a
Yeah.
rule. You didn't clean your room. New rule.
New rule.
But
Right. Exactly.
this isn't parenting. So, what is the book Fortune that you've wrote? Because how long did this take to write? Because this seems heartbreak. Like just reading your story,
Mm.
and that's not just your story. It's a story of millions of people.
Yeah.
It's gut wrenching.
Well, well, first of all, thank you so much for the honor of reading it. Um, Not everyone picks up a book and actually reads, so I appreciate that.
Mm,
And I wrote it because I really, literally, I felt called to write it. I felt called to write it, and it was my family story. Took 30 years to research, and I'm still researching it.
hmm
Genealogy is the kind of thing that literally never ends because there's just all these rabbit trails you can follow,
Yeah.
and questions. There's a million questions that come up. The more you find out, the more questions surface, right? So, but 30 years to research and about 4 years to write, 2 years to write the proposal and 2 years to write the book, which is very unusual for me because all my previous books only took about a month or two to
Mm,
write. So this was a real labor of love. And the law that you're referring to that got changed was really one of the things that was like, whoa,
hmm
like it was kind of a game changer when I did that. First of all, we realized that my 7 times great grandmother, Fortune McGee Game, or Game McGee, depending on what you're reading, that she was a mixed race woman. And as a result, her body absorbed the trauma of those very first race laws in Maryland. And those laws were created in order to solve a problem on the ground, as all laws are. I mean, I learned
hmm
a lot just about lawmaking. I mean, I
Yeah.
got a master's in human rights, but there was something about this process that made me realize, wow, like, okay, so the issue they were trying to solve on the ground in Maryland was different than Virginia. And Virginia, where the very first race laws happened, they were trying to solve the problem of white masters or owners of enslaved people raping their enslaved women and then producing mixed race children.
hmm
And by English law, because it was an English colony, British colony, um, the children of a British citizen could not be enslaved. And you traced British citizenship through the father.
Yeah.
So this is what you were talking about.
Yeah.
So they said, well, we'll just change where citizenship comes from. So the
Yeah.
thing that blows my mind when I think about this is 3 separate sets of laws have traced their genesis to this law that passed in Virginia in 1662: citizenship laws, gender laws, and race laws. All three come from that 1662 law,
Yeah.
because it's the first time you have any law that has anything to do with gender, any law that identifies this is the group that will be able to be enslaved, and that was people, basically Black people, people of African descent, and this is what citizenship means on this land. So
Yeah.
then 2 years later in Maryland, they passed a similar law, but the problem they were solving for was white women coming from England and marrying enslaved Black men and having mixed race children. And of course, the planters, who were white men, said, "Oh, we can't
Yeah.
have that." So
Yeah.
they passed the law that ended up indenturing my ancestor.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and then even not to belabor that point, but then it's like in the middle of the book, they're like, yeah, but then if you have a baby, that baby's an indentured for 21 years, but this one 30 years, but this one, I'm just going to make up years because honestly, I got confused. 7 years, 9 years. We feel like
Yeah.
it's Tuesday for 15 years. Let's just,
Yeah.
like, I literally could not. I
Yeah.
started diagramming and then I just got confused and then
Yeah.
realized it's
It's
anyway.
not logical. And
Right.
so the reason for that was because Well, in some ways it is, right? You basically, the logic was this: white men were starting to feel overrun by Black bodies because Maryland started to have more and more and more people of African descent coming to be, well, being brought to be enslaved to that territory. And as they did, they started to feel threatened because, well,
Mhm.
so they began to clamp down
Yeah.
on this concept of race, and more lost. So finally, like by the 1740s, 45, I mean, it is heinous. And there's a web of like 50 laws, 50 different provisions in these race laws, where it only started with four,
Yeah.
in 1664.
Yeah. Yeah. At the very, very beginning, like literally in the introduction, you talk about a concept of re-membered versus dismembered.
Yeah.
What is that? Just for
Yeah.
those that haven't read the book yet.
Well, we think about memory, right? And I'm not the first person to think of memory in this way. But memory is bringing members together, your memory together with what happened, like bringing it together. Well, in so many ways in America, we have dismembered our memory from ourselves. We have covered over history, what actually happened. We have twisted it. We have repressed it. So remembering ourselves is bringing ourselves back into right relationship with what happened, and also with each other. It is remembering our ancestors, going back and finding out their stories, being reconnected. It's really about connection to memory, connection to our ancestors, connection to our history.
Hmm. I can't find the page because I read this mostly in traffic jams. How often do you come down to Charlottesville? Just infrequently?
Infrequently, but I've been there a few times over the last several
There is a
years.
stretch of the interstate that during the time change, the sun comes up and people forget that the sun comes up and they won't clean their windshield, I think is what happens. And so there's a accident on the interstate weekly, which I hope
Wow.
that no one is hurt outside of the cars. But it has given me a lot of time to read in my car. I just keep books in the car because I'm literally sitting there for 45 minutes doing
Oh my
absolutely
gosh.
nothing, just
Wow.
idling. So I don't have my notes in front of me, but there is a section in here talking about race laws, and the reason I ask that is the reason I want to work this into the conversation is the name of the show is, can I say this at church? And there's a section here where you say, a major role of the church, and I believe it's in Virginia at the time,
Yes.
is to institute, be a part of, administer. I believe it's a part where maybe it's Maryland or Virginia, like indentured slaves
Yes.
were like owned by like the congregant body or maybe I'm saying it wrong,
By the
but
parish.
that is one of those things that people don't talk about at church.
Oh yeah, they don't talk about
Could
that at
you
church.
could you please and maybe give a lot more context than my very disjointed memory of the sentence?
Well, one of the reasons why I wrote the book is because not only have we dismembered our memory, our national memory, but our church memory. And when we have to understand our own complicity in the crafting of this construct called race, and one of the ways that the principal way that the church was a part of this design of the construct was, it's actually kind of deep. In 1664, when Maryland passed its law, this happened in Maryland, by the way. It also happened in Virginia, but I know the Maryland history better. In 1664, when Maryland passed its law, what it said, the law was that white women who marry Black men and have children by those Black men who are enslaved shall become enslaved themselves by their husband's master until their husband's death. And their children will be enslaved in perpetuity forever. So it turned out between 1664 and 1670, that's only what, 6 years, the legislature looked up and realized, this Catholic legislature, by the way, looked up and said, wait a minute, we're now seeing that planters are now forcing their Irish indentured servants to marry Black men, have children by them so that they can get all the free labor.
Mm-hmm.
So they were like, oh, this is an unintended consequence. We didn't mean to do this. We're going to take the power to decide who gets indentured and who gets enslaved out of the hands of the planter and put the lock and key in the hands of the church. So the church then became the primary arbiter of who got enslaved and who got indentured. They kept all the court records. I mean, the most accurate court records will be found in church parishes. But
Mhm.
the unfortunate reality is that many of those church records are no longer in existence because of fires or moving. They weren't very good keepers of them, but
Yeah.
they ended up being the arbiters of oppression in
Yeah.
Maryland, and also eventually also in Virginia.
Yeah. Yeah. I've seen that as well. So my dad did his DNA ancestry test a few years ago, and he passed away recently, last year of cancer. And but I
Sorry.
did a lot of his ancestry for him, and I remember one of the last trips I took to Texas, we went all the way through it, as far back as we could go. And I learned a lot about my family that I didn't know, because not everything is written down in a picture or in a note, but like it's a lot
That's
of these
right.
things are so passed down. And my grandmother on his side passed away when I was 2. It's like I have none of those stories. I'm totally relying on dad's
Wow.
recollection, because my
Yeah.
grandfather's also passed. So
Yeah. Yeah.
um but it has caused me to continue to do the ancestry stuff. And one of the things that I have found is just how surprised I've been at some of my ancestors. As you worked through some of your family history, and as you're still working through it, where have you been the most surprised, where you were like, this is mind altering, life shattering, changes the trajectory of some of the things that you see or maybe you hold?
Wow. I honestly think that chapter one, was kind of the chapter that truly blew my mind. First of all, that we could go back that far.
Hmm.
And the fact that we could go back that far to 1687 is when Fortune was born, is because her mother was white, because her mother was an Irish indentured servant,
Mm.
actually in Ulster, Irish. So she was actually Scottish indentured servant. And so um, that's the privilege of whiteness. So I was blown away by the reality that underneath my black skin, I had the privilege of whiteness,
Mm.
because one of my lines goes back to a white woman. The second thing that blew my mind was the second chapter, actually, Henry Lawrence and Harriet Lawrence. So looking at that part of the family, that was the part of the family that always said we're part Native American, but they actually never said it. They, unlike others, they didn't actually speak about that because
Yeah.
they didn't want to be accused of passing. But the stories were there. And so I tried to trace those stories. And what I found was that there is an absolute obliteration of the stories there through, primarily through the systems of identity that were constructed by the colonizer, by England. Um, what makes someone Indian? That had a whole different, there was a whole different system in place that was constructed by native tribes and nations than what is in place now, which was constructed by the US government. And the reason why the US government constructed the construct it had is because it wanted to breed native people out of America. It
Hmm.
wanted native people to disappear. And that is
Yeah.
exactly what happened.
Yeah.
When I looked back at the Cherokee Dawes rolls from 1890, the last Dawes rolls, I was blown away to see that the majority of the people on the Dawes rolls were like 132nd Cherokee,
Hmm.
118th Cherokee. And that was then. So what do you think they are now? Yet they are Cherokee because they can trace their people to the Dawes rolls. Well,
Yeah.
we can't do that because in our family and our family's story, they did not walk the trail. They ran up into the hills and they hid. Um,
Yeah.
and the stories have been obscured. And so I think what I realized is that identity itself has been mangled and twisted and covered over. And it's one of the reasons why our nation has really kind of given up the project of trying to figure out who we are. And we're so future oriented, we're so future focused, and it's all about, well, get your stuff now. But we're getting stuff in a state that's unanchored. It's not tethered to actual truth, to land, to people, to stories that actually happened. Instead, it's all about dreaming forward, but in an untethered state, which becomes mostly about domination. In order to succeed, then you have to dominate the other.
Yeah.
That has become our story as a nation.
Yeah. 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 You say that later on in the book, maybe like 160, 170. I remember highlighting that anyway. Yeah. So I'm going to skip around a bit because I don't have you for as long as I would love to have you. So,
Sure, that's fine.
there is a chapter called Sharon, and in there you're talking about education and inequality.
Yes.
And the reason I don't, so I constantly try to convince my kid that it is extremely important um, to know history. And I also try to ride the line of there is more history when it comes to the church, when it comes to Virginia, when it comes to the school you sit in, my son. Like there is more history than just what is in those stupid books,
That's
because I
great.
am aware how much power Texas has and what the heck is in those books because I grew up in Texas.
That's right.
The same way
That's
that
right.
California has power over what's in the cars that are in New Jersey or whatever. Um, you say in here, education inequity is violence. One might argue that it is an act of warfare against the flourishing of fellow citizens.
Yes.
How so? Because I like it. I'd like you to talk to my son as well. We don't need to make it that general, but how so? And I will say the stories about it. It appears that Sharon in the stories is extremely good student, and so like, oh well, we need to get you out of class. This can't be. We can't have you educated. You know better than
Yeah.
that.
That's
Yeah,
right.
yeah.
That's
So
right.
how is it an act of violence, and possibly how is it still, if you feel like it is still?
Oh, it's very much. So, education is really at the heart of, or has become at the heart in the 20th century of the struggle for racial equality with the passage of Brown versus the Board of Education. It was that whole separate but equal thing, right? So, what you saw in those old time pictures were the one room schoolhouse for the Black children and this massive complex for white children. Well, that was in the South, but in the North, you had a very similar situation. And my mom's story, Sharon, I think it's chapter 7, no, chapter 6. Her story really illustrates this. She was in Philadelphia, it's a northern city, but she had de facto segregation, which is what we have today. In fact, schools today are more segregated than they were back in 1953 before passage of the Brown versus Board of Education a
This
Supreme
would be
Court
through
ruling.
gentrification and other socio-political things, redlining.
And
Yeah.
yes,
Yeah, you're
yes,
definitely talking my
redlining.
language as a banker now. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah,
100%.
exactly.
Yes.
Okay, so and redlining was outlawed, and we get into that actually in the last chapter.
Except
But
for
it's
we did
also
it a
the
couple years ago in Chicago. Maybe a year
hello.
ago, the lady just won a court case. What is the name? Yeah.
It's
You
happening
you know
all
what
the
I'm referencing.
time.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, no, it's happening all the time. And in 2014, there were banks that were brought up on charges of redlining
Hmm.
in New Jersey, right? So this is New Jersey, like
Yeah.
right next to New York City, by the way, like right there. So what we have is we have a situation where the structures themselves have created de facto segregation, not de jure, as which was what Brown versus the Board of Education was about, as in like intentional, but de facto, as in, oh, it's just happening. But it's happening because of gentrification and the pushing out of people who have lived there for generations. So my mom lived in South Philadelphia. She went to a Black school. There was a white school 2 blocks away that she actually should have been able to go to, but they didn't let her go. They let her next door neighbor, who was white, go to that school, but she couldn't go.
Hmm.
Somehow he was in the district and she was outside. So one day she's sitting in the principal's office while running an errand for the teacher, being pulled out of class because she was such a good student. She got pulled out of class to run an errand. And she sees a box of books sitting next to her. And she starts to thumb through these books, and they are raggedy, missing pages, missing covers. And but she sees the stamp in it that says that they're from the white school 2 blocks down. So those books got passed down like 10 years later to the Black students.
Hmm.
That they teaches a lesson. You are not worthy of of new books. You're not worthy of the latest information. We are not preparing you to lead. We're preparing you to go to jail. We're preparing you to do service jobs that are going to help us
Yeah.
actually flourish, us meaning white people flourish. So today, we have the tracking system that does exactly that within multi-ethnic school districts, or a single school that has lots of different ethnicities. If you go to the VOTEC area, you're going to see mostly people of color. If you go to the general math area, you're going to see mostly people of color. Why? Because general math is not preparing you to go to college.
Right.
That's preparing you for service industry jobs. If you go to college bound, it's going to be mostly white folk. And if you go to honors and AP, almost all white folk. And some Asian folk too, because they also are going down that track. That's a whole nother podcast conversation. But that has to do with economics. And
Yeah.
when Asian people come to America, generally speaking, especially East Asian, they're coming with means. So they're not poor. They're not having to struggle. And so therefore, education is, they're able to pay their way into the best schools, XYZ. So the education system today, I had a conversation with a board of education director in Los Angeles, and she explained in this conversation that the best teachers are funneled into rich areas, which tend to be more white. Yeah. You have emergency credential teachers that are funneled into Black areas, poorer areas. So, but just
what do you mean emergency credentialed? Like, hey, I have a college degree and you need a teacher, I've got you.
Substitute teachers.
Okay.
Substitute teachers are funneled year round. Substitute teachers are funneled into areas that are poorer, that have
no consistency, no relationship, no mentorship, no leadership,
no training.
Yeah.
Like no college education for education, no graduate degrees, which are in the white areas. So you tell me, and no books. No books. They don't get books. My mom at least got a 10-year-old book. Today, they're not even getting books.
Just the Chromebooks.
So you tell me, would you be able to go and get your college education if you had a substitute teacher year round and no books? And on top of that, you're poor. So your parents may not even have the money to give you breakfast in the morning. So you spend the first half of the day, unless you are fortunate enough to get a breakfast in the morning at school, you spend the first half of the day being hungry. So you can't concentrate.
Yeah.
And, stuff is happening at home that you have to worry about. This is the inequity that currently exists in our system.
Yeah. Well, just even here in Virginia, Governor Youngkin, or Governor-elect Youngkin, ran on a propaganda of critical race theory in the schools, which is funny because it's not even taught in schools.
It's not. No.
And I won't even try to speak to critical race theory. Because I don't know enough. But I know that it's not taught to my children in schools. I also know that it is I talked about this with my brother. It actually makes sense. Like, it makes sense regardless of the country. Rome makes rules for Rome to work. Babylon makes rules for Babylon to work. Pharaoh makes rules for a Pharaoh to prosper. That's just the way civilizations are done. I make the rules to benefit me.
Empires are done.
Yeah. Even in my house, I make the rules to benefit me. You are 12 years old, mow the grass, and I'm going to watch you do it while I drink hot coffee. That's an overgeneralization, but that's just ridiculous. But there's like a war. They'll say there's like a war on education or a war on our kids' minds or whatever. And I use that word intentionally because later on you say, in a war, there are no humans, only allies and enemies. And so the question I have is the goal to rehumanize, or is the goal to all be allies? Because obviously enemies is not the goal.
So. Yeah, that's a really profound question. I would say that the goal is to rehumanize everyone so that everyone gets to be fully and simply human. Everyone gets to live fully into the image of God that is within them. And everyone must bow to the reality that they are not God. They are made in the likeness of God, but they are not God. And I think that people of color, basically everybody who ain't a white man in America, has had laws that have been crafted to basically keep them in their place so that white men can flourish. And that's the thing, this is what critical race theory says. I know you don't want to get into it fully, but look.
Well, I'm just ignorant of it. And so I don't want to speak poorly.
Well,
I refuse to talk to you until I finished your book. Like, I won't talk to a person unless I've read the text, because I find that disrespectful. So
I really appreciate that, by the way, because a lot of people are kind of disrespectful. So
it's easy to fake it, but it's hard to ask real questions if you didn't actually read it.
Yeah. So. Well, what I found when I did the research for my book was that, these laws and these policies actually, there were laws and policies that shaped the course of my ancestors' lives. That is the theory of critical race theory. And I didn't set out to prove critical race theory. I didn't even know what it was till a couple of years ago, which is ironic. I never read anything about it. It's just the way it works. Yeah. Laws create systems. Laws create a flow of life. That's what they're meant to do. They're meant to solve problems on the ground, perceive problems on the ground, or real ones, and create a flow of life. Now, unfortunately, because of who made those laws in the very beginning, from 1662 all the way to 1971, I believe, or 67 was when Loving versus Virginia happened. And that was one of the last.
70s.
Yeah, that was one of the last overturnings of those first race laws, happened in
Mhm.
with the Loving versus Virginia ruling, because it was the reversal of the 1662 law.
Yeah.
So from 1662 all the way to 19 whatever it was, I think it was 67 actually, there was this, the Virginia, at least indefinitely the nation, was living under the oppression of these laws, and Black bodies then had to live around and twist themselves to fit into the boxes and the streams of life that were carved for them. That's the theory. And it's not theory for anybody who lived it, it's reality. And what I found is that that was exactly the reality for my own family,
Yeah.
and in education and housing and jobs. One thing that also blew my mind, really literally like, boo, like mind blown, in Charleston, South Carolina, and in the state of South Carolina after the Civil War, they passed laws after the fall of Reconstruction or the end of Reconstruction. They passed laws that outlawed um, people of African descent from working in any industry that was not the fields or domestic service. They could not. If you had the brain of a scientist, you had to be a maid or a field worker in
Mm.
South Carolina
Mm.
because of the law. So you wonder why people streamed north in the Great Migration. They were getting away from those laws. But that also changed the course of life, because
Yeah.
that disconnected us again from our
Yeah.
families. I have
Yeah.
a whole like DNA set of family down in South Carolina and also Virginia that I've never met and will likely never know
Yeah.
because of the Great Migration, because terror and laws caused our families to figure out how to survive, and survival meant disconnection
Yeah.
from family.
Yeah. Well, not only that, but treating people in that way robs everyone. I say this often to people that live around me because I live there. I mean, my neighbors are African American. My other neighbors on the other, like my neighbors across the street are Asian American. Like I live in a place that is very diverse, though the school's not all that diverse. I'm not sure how to reconcile that because I don't know where everybody's kids go to school, though their kids won, so that's not fair. I always tell people the kids around me, I need them all to be well educated because I don't plan on not living here, and I live here. And I
Yeah.
will need you to not, I will need you to know what the heck is happening when you become an
Yes.
adult. And so it makes me wonder, like, like how much knowledge or progression of just technology and science and faith and humanities have we robbed ourselves of out of half
Yes.
of a millennia of just saying you're not allowed to be smart.
That is
You're not
so
allowed
true.
to contribute.
Yes.
It's just
It's
anyway.
kind of economically stupid, isn't it? I mean, think about that. It really is kind of economically stupid. What we have
Yeah.
done is we have suppressed the earning power and the buying power of America by pushing like 2/3 of its people, not only people of color, but also poor white people,
Yeah.
into an economic status where they don't have enough to buy what they need.
Yeah. To get what they need to get done. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Do you have time for three more questions? I think three.
Sure.
Maybe two. No,
This is fun.
I had another one and I've lost it now, and maybe it'll come back to me. Oh no, I do remember my question. So the first question is: so I am a white man.
Mhm.
That happens. It's
I
on
see
the
that.
website. Yeah, people can do it. I don't think that our nation, or really people for that matter, have been trained in a way to deal with the trauma. And so to rehumanize people, to remember people, will feel painful, and probably
Yes.
painful for everyone. You talk about in the book a bit that you know, not every, like I think you say in the book, like white people, when there's trauma, they tend to come together as community, which is the inverse of what happens for people that aren't white. They fragment and disenfranchise and go off and do things on their own, which isn't good for humans. That we're not good to be on our own. They talk about that in Genesis, actually. So it's
Hello.
not. So
Yeah.
what, where should, how do people begin to prepare themselves to face that trauma? And I say prepare to face that trauma because I am very hopeful that my kids will be much better at this than you or I am, and than my grandfathers were. And so the trauma is coming.
Hold on 1 second.
Sure.
No need. No need. No need. Down. Down. Good girl. Good girl. Down. Good
Poor
girl.
dog.
Yeah, okay.
So the trauma is coming. I hopefully find it. I'm hopeful that it is inevitable. So how do we begin to prepare for that?
I think that what we have to do is we have to build up our resilience capacity. And a lot of that has to do with making sure that we are not only remembering in our minds, but also remembering our bodies. Our bodies hold that trauma. There are several really great books about this. My Grandmother's Hands is one that has been really a big one for me. And then also The Body Keeps the Score is
Mm-hmm.
another book that came out recently. But these books have been instrumental for me in the last 1 year, helping me to understand that my body really does hold the stories. It holds it in the tension in my back. It holds it in some ailments that are coming because the stress has actually created ailments in my body because I'm not moving that energy through. And for people of African descent and people of color in general, Native people, um, new immigrants, especially with all the trauma that has happened over the last several years
Mm.
under the last administration, there is the stories are being held in our bodies if we are not working it out.
Mm.
And for people of European descent, I think that I would move more to the language of moral injury than use trauma. There is a certain trauma that actually in My Grandmother's Hands that Resmaa Menakem, the author of that book, talks about white-bodied pain, right? So people who are white-bodied and the trauma of encounter of the evil that has been done on your behalf, right?
Mm.
There is something to be said for that. I would recommend you read that book.
Mm.
That book really does have, I think, answers for people who are white-bodied as you are engaging in the stories and seeing maybe for the first time what actually happened on your behalf. There is something dehumanizing about encountering evil. When we encounter evil, something of the image of God in us gets twisted, gets crushed, gets suppressed. And it is the work then, our work is actually to blow life back into the image of God within us, that within us that actually is able to breathe and flourish and believe and hope and dream and partner with God in the stewardship of the world. So for people who are white-bodied, it's really going to be a question of going back and looking into your family stories and forgiving your ancestors and allowing yourselves to be forgiven for inaction now. I think that mostly what people are trying to escape and not looking into the stories is the shame. But shame tells a lie. Shame tells the lie that you are the worst thing you've ever done. I don't say that. You are not. You are not the worst thing you've ever done. And you are not the worst thing your ancestors have ever done. Instead, there are wrongs that actually happened and actually did change the course of life for whole people groups. What we need to do now is simply fix it.
Yeah.
There's a difference between shame and guilt. Shame tells you are the worst thing you've ever done. Guilt says, okay, you did something. Now make it right.
Yeah. I like that. Now make it right. Last two questions. So what do you feel like as a congregate of a faith body? I don't really care even what the faith body is. Should be some things that people in the pew should be talking about, that pastors, ministers should be listening to. And if we don't begin to speak about these things, the church as we know it is a lost cause, that it will become a nationwide, this is going to sound bad. Like my fear for the church is that somehow we're all ostracized in the same way the Amish are. Like, look at those people over there. They used to do things. You know what I mean? And I don't say that poorly against Amish. I have some Amish friends. You know what I mean? But what do you feel like we should be speaking about in our church? And I use it as a play on words again of the name of the show.
Yeah, I understand. I think that if the last 500 years were about the reformation of the church, then the next 500 years, starting now, has to be about the decolonization of the church, meaning that this brown faith, this faith that rises from Afro-Asian people, literally Africa is all over the Bible, and so are parts of Asia, all over the Bible. There's only one person in the entire Bible that has a speaking role who is actually from Europe, and that's Pilate. Sorry, I just got to say it. It's true. That's
No,
that's the only
this is
speaking
not
bowl
news to
European.
me. Yeah.
But I was kind of blown away when I thought about that, because think of where the power to determine orthodoxy lies in the
Mm,
church.
yeah.
It's in Europe. It's in the halls of empire. That's who has determined what this text means,
Mm,
who this person of Jesus is. And it's been whiteified, as I like to say. It's been Europeanized, but it didn't come from there. So I think what we're realizing now, what we are seeing as the church is declining, and decline everywhere, except, interestingly, in communities of color, in
mm,
oppressed communities around the world. That is where the church is growing. The church is now located principally in the southern hemisphere,
mm,
not in the north and not in the west. And why is that? I think it's because when we pick up that text, it's the same reason that the Second Great Awakening was actually triggered by the Black church, the creation of the Black church. It's because when we pick up that text, we see ourselves.
mm.
We see a brown people oppressed by empire,
Repeatedly.
colonized and enslaved, exactly, serially enslaved, and struggling to flourish,
Mm,
struggling to understand its relationship to the world and God. That is what that text is about.
mm,
But it is not how it's taught at all. It's not
mm,
taught like that in white churches pretty much anywhere. Why? Because it's not the social location that the reader is coming from. So, what does it take? It's going to take the decolonization of our read of the text. It's going to take churches of European descent coming together with churches and communities of color and reading that text together,
mm.
so that they can begin to understand things they haven't seen before.
Yeah. Yeah. I like that. I like that. Matter of fact, Barrett, if you're listening, let's do that. There's a nice church across the street that would, yeah, I would love that.
There you go.
Yeah. Barrett happens to be my pastor. I have no idea if he's listening. Probably isn't. It's okay though. So when you, Lisa, try to wrap words around whatever God is, whatever the divine is, what is that?
God is love. God is love.
Mm,
And I've really come to understand it literally is all about love. The call of our lives, the purpose of our lives. The purpose of our lives is to be deeply and radically connected to all things, including God.
mm,
God, each other, the rest of creation, the systems that govern us. That's the goal of life. That's what God cared about. When God looked around, this is from my previous book, The Very Good
mhm,
Gospel.
mhm.
When God looked around at the end of the sixth day and said, "This is very good." What God was talking about was not saying there was a really good walrus that God just made, or a great cloud over there. But no, what God was saying was the goodness existed between things, not
Mm,
inside the things. So the relationships between things were very good. And it's the relationships between things that were broken in the fall, that
mm,
all fell down when we grabbed at peace in our own way at the expense of the peace of all else.
mm.
So the goal is to be reconnected. And the most radical connection we can have is love. And and isn't it John who says, God is love?
Mm. Yeah, yeah. Where to plug the places that people should be doing the things after they listen to this. They should engage in the work that you're doing, or partner in the work that you're doing. Probably, actually, yeah, partner in the work that Lisa's doing.
Thank you.
Where would
That's
you
really
point people
great.
to?
Well, I would say definitely check out our website and sign up for the newsletter. And check out my website at lisasharonharper.com. Sign up for the newsletter. Read the books. But The Very Good Gospel came out in 2016. I still highly recommend that, but definitely pre-order Fortune. Fortune's coming out February 8th. Fortune is going to tell you 10 generations of my family story as a window into American history. And then in the last 3 chapters, essays on how to repair it all.
Yeah,
And the work that we do is consulting. We also have an institute. So if you want to go deeper on any of these concepts on race and gender, and healing the world, then log on to our institute and take some of our downloadable courses. It's
yeah,
really
definitely.
It's a great, and also, of course, our podcast, Freedom Road Podcast. You can check us out once a month,
Yeah.
anywhere you get your good podcasts.
It is once a month then. Okay. I looked at it. I'm like, this seems to be infrequent. Once a month seems to be a lot more manageable than weekly.
Oh,
I can tell you that right now. Anyway, thank you for the extra time. I know we went over. I've genuinely enjoyed speaking to you and Babe as well. Why not? Yeah. Welcome to the show, Babe. But
Aw.
thank you again, Lisa, for coming on. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Seth. Really great to meet you. And this was an awesome conversation. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, I will end